I got lots of notes here.
Oh, boy. We're going to have to fight for airtime.
I got stuff to say.
Just brief reminder not to get canceled. Just
No. I don't think there's anything cancelable in my notes.
That's what they all say before they get canceled. Welcome to another episode of the Thinking Well and Why podcast, part of the Awareness to Action podcast network. My name is Creek, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Mario Sikora and Lee Fields, who will reason carefully about a decision for 6 weeks and then make it in the parking lot right before they walk in. That daily delusion brought to you by Antonio Damasio from Descartes' Error. Yeah, there we go. So last two episodes, we've been talking about how the brain is a story-making machine. And you might get the thought that we're just think harder and your life will be better. But there might be other ways. There might be other ways to figure out how to make a decision, and that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, you might think we're just a bunch of brains on a stick. Right?
Yes, yes.
We're snobs.
We're going to complicate what we've been talking about the past few episodes. Mario.
Yes. Why this topic?
Why this topic?
Yeah. So people often look in this podcast, but also in most of the work I do, there's a heavy emphasis on critical thinking and clear thinking skills. And because we emphasize that so much, people tend to think that we dismiss, quote unquote, other ways of knowing, and that we dismiss the value of learning signals from our body, or perceiving signals from our body, or paying attention to our emotional states and feeling and expressing our emotions. And that's just not true. I mean, I try to remind people that the first book I wrote was actually on the Enneagram and emotional intelligence. But the reason I emphasize clear thinking skills so much is because I do think that it's something not really talked about that much in the Enneagram world. And I also think, quite frankly, that the challenges to clear thinking are one of the most critical things we face as a society, quite frankly, in the age of information overload. However, the other stuff is important too. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we know that we say and talk about other quote unquote ways of knowing, but we also need to define what that means. Okay, so not all ways of knowing are appropriate for every task. And what we really need to teach ourselves to understand is what are all the ways of knowing stuff, depending on what we're meaning by that. And when do we use which tool? What problem are we trying to solve? And therefore, what tool is appropriate? So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Lee, can you define knowing?
Nope. I know my limitations.
What I know is that I don't know anything.
That's right.
Socrates.
Well, I could look up a definition of knowing, but I would say that for our conversation,
the definition of knowing.
But I'm going to use other senses.
Okay.
It
feels like
right, yeah. And I think that what knowing feels like is in relationship to clarity and certainty, right? Like there's a sense that there's a right answer or some conclusion to be drawn. And so how I think of knowing is when I have sorted through the data that there is and come to a conclusion about what I think, what I feel, or what I think I should do. Mm-hmm. In truth, I usually do that way faster and a lot more clumsily than I think I am. So I might arrive to certainty quickly, but I might not actually know what's going on.
I would say, I'm just kind of coming up with this on the spot, but thinking through at least the outcome of knowing is perceived predictability. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think through and falsify that. I can't see an exception to, I think I know something, but what I'm actually saying is there's a perceived predictability about it. Because that's the only reason of knowing something.
Yeah, I like to think about degrees of probability. right, when it comes to knowing. I'm always leery of claims of knowledge. And look, there are certain things, we can know that, for example, Columbus landed, in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. Okay, it's a pretty established fact. Do I 100% know that? No, but the evidence is pretty good, right? Because of all the data points that point to it. I do know that the Earth is a sphere. There's certain things that I do know, but most of what we're encountering day to day, moment to moment, is I think what you're getting at, Creek, is, how confident can I feel, or how confident can I be in what I am assuming right now?
Yeah, in order to act in a way that is
Exactly.
not
Right.
in constant processing mode.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we don't know for 100% certain that gravity will always work forever and everywhere, but I suggest you act as if it will. And otherwise, you're going to step off a building and it will work more than likely. Right. So, yeah, there are things when we have to, at some point, say, okay, I am going to act as if this is a fact and if this is a rule. But, who knows? Someday we might wake up and things float to the ceiling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of in an earlier episode, we were talking about Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking. And that's similarly applying the right tool for the task,
Yeah.
So just sort of pulling that thread of what is the risk of being wrong in the probability prediction,
Yeah.
and applying that level of rigor to the thinking.
Yeah. I think when, people push back and, raise the objection that, oh, you're ignoring other ways of knowing, we have to now get into the conversation of what are some of those other ways of knowing? What do we mean by ways of knowing? And when do we use which? So typically what I do is say, okay, there are different ways of knowing different things. If we are discussing a matter of fact, okay, something having to do with how the natural world works, then we want to use things like science and reason and logic and rationality and, all the empiricism. But if we're talking about, do I love my kids? Okay, well, there's no facts, or what is love? There's no way of, from my perspective, of usefully explaining those things from a scientific perspective. But the feeling of love is far more instructive about what it is to love someone than any description of it could be. All right. You can tell me about all the chemical responses that are happening in my body and all that stuff. And that's interesting, but that's background, right? To know what love is to experience love. It's not to describe love or define love or prove love or anything like that. So we've got kind of these.
There's
Go ahead.
it's not even a pushback, but art
Yeah.
is a form of trying to describe and name and all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I got a bunch of notes on that very topic.
Yeah,
so
you
that
got a
when we
lot of
come
notes
back
today. So.
I do.
Yeah.
Well, because it's a topic that I feel is important to understand. And, there are mistakes on both sides of this discussion. Okay. So you've got one side, again, and we're talking generalities here, right? So you have some people who say, oh, well, science doesn't, answer everything. Well, of course it doesn't. And scientists would be the first one to tell you that. But then you have other people who say, well, if you can't prove it, if you can't demonstrate it, well, then it doesn't matter, or you don't talk about it. Now, honestly, I don't really know anybody, and I don't think I've ever met anybody that actually says that or believes it, but it is the perception. right? And on the kind of more subjective experience side of this discussion, there are a lot of accusations of, oh, you're just, what is it? It's called the Spock fallacy, right? Where there's this assumption that just because somebody's talking about science doesn't mean that they don't feel things or see the value in feeling things. Okay? But we have to understand that when we're talking about subjective experience, such as love, such as awe, such as pain and suffering, well, then the facts of it, the explanation of it don't matter. The feeling of it, which is what matters, and that feeling of it can tell us something.
I might be taking us on a bunny trail here, but the thing that I don't, struggle's not the right word, but the whole thing of like facts don't care about your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not entirely sure that facts. How do we know facts are true except by a feeling? I think that the feel. Sure, you can have a bunch of data, but at some point, it's like I have a feeling that there's now enough data for me to have a large degree of certainty. It still comes back to some sort of sensational, like settledness of like, I've done the work in the best sort of circumstances. I've done the work to make sure this is as predictable as possible, but it still comes back. There's still some sort of feeling left to the fact that I rely on.
I think this is where it's about handing off which tool is needed for the job, right? You're thinking about something or collecting data or observing or whatever up to a point, and then you to slow the process down to language it, you begin to have a physical sense that you're comfortable around that much data. You're in the process of deciding, and that process has sensations that go with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And your brain is seeing that and deciding with the predictive element, okay, we have enough data here to know what's going on. We're going to proceed. You know, that's the normal, that's a good application of switching between tools. That was what I was going to say.
Yeah. So there's a progression that happens. Okay. So some sort of sensation happens to us that makes us notice something. All right. So I feel something. Maybe I notice that I'm feeling anger. I notice that I'm feeling shame. I notice that I'm feeling frustration, whatever it is. So my body is experiencing something. And what does that do? It makes me stop and say, what is this? Okay. And this is when kind of the reasoning part of our brain takes over and says, oh, okay, well, here's what's happening around me. And probably I'm pissed off because they cut me off in the front of the road, and on the road. And so, okay, how should I respond to that? And so forth. And so all these things are happening where they're started by some sort of subjective experience. And then we reason through, what should I do now? But we can do all the reasoning in the world. And if it's substantive, we still have to go back to, okay, this is what rationality tells me, or my capacity for reasoning tells me I should do. But how do I really feel about that? It's a great story. I don't even know if it's true or not, but it's a great story about Darwin when he was deciding whether or not to get married. He took a piece of paper, and on one side he wrote down all the advantages of being married, and on the other side all the disadvantages of being married. And the list of disadvantages was a lot longer, right? But he decided to get married anyway. Why? Because he loved the woman who he ended up marrying. And so we can kind of gather all the facts, and we can reason through something, but then we have to still ask ourselves, okay, how does that fit with me? And you referenced Damasio's Descartes error earlier, and I'm not sure if it's in that book. Probably. He tells the story of this guy Phineas Cage, who was a railroad worker who had this spike go through his head and take out part of his brain. And it's a very famous story because everybody thought, geez, this guy's dead. He just, the spike just went through his head. But his reasoning capacity was fine, but he struggled to make decisions. Right? He struggled to decide, what was the right way to treat people and so forth. So he could still reason, But that emotional aspect that tells you, okay, pull the trigger was missing. And so he couldn't pull the trigger. He couldn't make these sort of decisions. So absolutely right. When it's again, but these are typically questions about choice and how we should live our lives. They're not questions about what does 2 plus 2 equal, right? Or is the earth flat or a sphere, or any of these other sort of natural, testable, falsifiable decisions. So the key thing is understanding, okay, what kind of problem, what kind of epistemic problem am I trying to solve here? What is the right tool for it? What tool do I use for this part of the question? And what tool do I use for that part of the question? Okay. And that's what clear thinking is all about. Okay, this is what I feel. This is what the facts are. Let me work toward a conclusion in that kind of topic. Where people run into problems is when their emotions or their feelings about something or their beliefs and assumptions about something make them depreciate or denigrate the actual facts of the matter. And that's where it gets dangerous. Okay. When, okay, the facts are this, but I don't like that. So I'm going to make a different claim, whether it's true or not.
I think this would be a good place to talk a little bit about, I lost my vocabulary word, confirmation bias, and how we're trying to resolve a cognitive dissonance between two opposing thoughts. So they can be opposing thoughts within ourselves, like we run into something where some data that is coming in conflicts with something we already believe, and that creates friction in our system or some discomfort or stress that we try to resolve. Or in communication, another person can bring that sort of binary or conflict between our thinking. And I think that that's one of the places where this different ways of knowing concern comes up in everyday life, is people start appealing to find a way to rationalize or reframe or sort of defend their position. And if facts won't do it or logical reasoning won't do it, then they reach for another tool in an effort to resolve their own internal stress and, in some cases, a disagreement or an argument, an external stress.
Yeah.
And I think this is a lot of what philosophy does in some regards it's the trolley problem for those that aren't familiar.
Define the trolley problem.
Yes. The trolley problem.
You can never find a trolley when you need it. That's the problem.
So
I'm always saying it.
I'm always saying it. Where are all the trolleys? So the trolley problem is there's a trolley on a track, and it's headed towards like 10 people on the railroad that are not aware of its existence. You are standing by the switch that changes the tracks. But if you change the tracks, then there's one person that will get run over. And you have to decide what is the better decision here. And there's many variations of that problem. You can turn the dials on that a bunch of different ways. But at the end of the day, you can go through reasoning and rationalizing and all this other stuff. Eventually someone just kind of throws up their hands because they're just like, oh, there really isn't a right one. It just depends on how you look at it. And I think it just has to come down to something that is kind of incalculable. It can't be that cognitive dissonance is not something we can resolve. And that's right. The annoying part about being human is like there's a lot that is just like, well, there's two decisions here. Neither one of them make me comfortable. Combining them isn't an option either. So I just have to kind of go off of vibes and things that I can't really articulate, but I'm just going to make the decision that I think is going to be the best one that makes me feel the best.
Yeah. And what's interesting about the trolley problem, you mentioned that there are lots of variations on it, and people's responses will vary based on the degree of agency they have, right? So people will react one way if it's just flipping a switch that sends the trolley one way. Another variation of it is you're standing on a bridge and there's a large person standing next to you, and you can save these 10 people by pushing this person off the bridge and onto the tracks to stop the trolley. And people are even more uncomfortable pushing the person than they are flipping the switch because there's a higher degree of agency. And so with these things, there's a great quote from a guy named Michael Mauboussin, who writes on investing. And he says there are two kinds of problems in life. There's a linear problem, which means A plus B equals C. Right? It's just one thing leads to another. There are facts involved. There's, not room for wiggle. And if you're dealing with a linear problem, you just do all the research, you identify as many facts as you can, and then you do what the next logical thing is. But when it's a nonlinear problem, meaning there's really no right answer, like the trolley, you do all the work, you observe all the facts, you think it through, and then you trust your gut. Right. And that's what it comes down to.
And I think this is, you mentioned the dangers of only looking at your emotional reaction to a situation and not factoring in the data or dismissing the data or whatever. And that is a danger. I think the danger that I probably run into the most for myself is my fear of being wrong, such that I will constantly overthink and just be waiting for more data and never make a decision.
Sure.
And that, actually, I think, Lee, you were in this Instagram thread where we someone sent a reel about the silly goose tax of like, in life, you're just going to have to be a silly goose. Like you're going to make decisions. And you're like, oh, that was dumb. I guess crystals didn't heal my sore throat. That was a silly thing to think. And that's just part of living. But I'm just terrified of the silly goose tax, I'm realizing. And sometimes I just have to make a decision and trust that I'll figure it out later. But there's a fear of being wrong or making the wrong choice.
So that's an interesting situation, because in that circumstance, right, so when we become paralyzed, we can try to manufacture that feeling of certainty and just sort of psych ourselves up and say, oh, just go do it. Or we can say, I'm resistant to this. What story am I telling myself that is stopping me from making this decision? How can I rewrite that story, et cetera, right? So it's almost like you're toggling all the time. Right. And that's how we have to think of this, is toggling back and forth and recognizing that that's part of the process. How do I feel about this? And okay, well, I feel this. And at what point do my feelings not matter, like you said? Okay, so again, again, another great quote from Einstein when he was challenging some of the early quantum thinkers, who were saying, well, if nobody sees the moon, it's not there. And he said, no, even a mouse, right? I mean, it was just kind of like this, to him, it was just sort of ridiculous. But his point was, it doesn't matter if you're there or not, the moon still is. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not, or you think the moon's too big or too small or anything like that. It's just, it's there whether you like it or not. But we can stand and look at the moon and we can have all kinds of reactions to it. And those reactions can be instructive. Okay? And this is where we have to, for those who diminish the value of subjective experience, it's important to understand that there are things about, and Creek, you mentioned the arts, and I think this is, for me, this is the best way to capture this, right? Because so I went to a concert the other night. So this is the 100th anniversary of the birth of John Coltrane this year, who I am a big fan of. And his son, Ravi Coltrane, is a very gifted saxophone player as well. And I've seen him, before. But he was playing in Philadelphia, where Coltrane spent his formative years, with the Philadelphia Orchestra, right? So it was Ravi Coltrane and his quartet playing with the Philadelphia Orchestra, playing the music of his father. Okay. And for me, that's like, it just doesn't get any better than that. Right. And, we were in the fourth row directly in front of Ravi Coltrane, right? I mean, I matched eyes with him a couple of times, so it was that close. And
You made eyes at him, or
we matched eyes.
matched
We
eyes,
made
okay.
eye contact, a
They're
couple of
basically
times.
one person now.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
are one person.
Yeah.
We had a mind meld of
Yeah.
sorts, right? Yeah, no, but I'm just saying that's how close we were, right?
Yeah.
That I
Mhm.
could tell. Hey, we just made eye contact. That's wild, right? So, but with Coltrane's music, as with many great artists, they convey things. They convey knowledge and experience and wisdom without reason and rationality, right? Yeah, and one of the ways in this really stood out to me is one of the songs that he did was called Alabama. Which, again, no words to it, but it is about the bombing of the church that killed the 4 little girls in Alabama, and this song was his response to it. And when you hear this music, now it helps to know that that's what it's about, but when you hear this music, it captures pain and anguish and anger all combined that says more about the human experience than any scientific explanation could, right? You feel something and you walk away from that knowing something in ways that, a simple explanation might not do it. Okay. And we experience this with art all the time, right? It can be music. It can be the visual arts, for example. I remember the first time I went to the Prado Museum and I had been reading Somerset Maugham's works and some of his essays. He would always talk about El Greco and how much El Greco moved him and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, all right, well, let's check this out, right? And so the Prado has these great El Greco collections. And I just was not prepared for the impact that a room filled with El Grecos had on me, right? And, and it's kind of medieval Christian art, but it is so powerful. And again, it tells you something about how we deal with mystery, how we deal with unknown, how we deal with questions of the divine, again, in a way that 100 philosophy books couldn't quite do. Okay. So we have to expose ourselves to these experiences and recognize that from what it does. Now, these El Greco paintings were filled with angels and doves representing the Holy Spirit and all this sort of stuff. And, and I don't have that belief system and that faith in the supernatural that El Greco did. But I was still profoundly moved by this. So I set rash. I'm not saying, well, that didn't really happen. There's, these angels aren't they? These cherubs don't have wings, all that sort of stuff. But that's a irrelevant set of observations. Okay. So again, the whole trick here is what is relevant to this question and what is not.
I really like what you're describing about engaging with visual art or music, or nature could be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of experiencing using different ways of knowing in a setting like that. It feels like without words, the examples that you've described here tonight don't have words, right?
Yeah.
It almost makes it easier because your mind doesn't have to be predicting what it should respond in a certain way. There's a different pace or cadence to how you can experience instrumental music or painting or a sculpture, to give you an opportunity to practice. I'm noticing a feeling coming up and not try to attach meaning to it so quickly that you have to verbalize your position. I think that's just want to point out here that that's a good way to practice using your different ways of knowing in a safe environment, to become more fluent and skill build with recognizing those things.
Yeah. And we should use those experiences, whereas, I agree with you in that moment, right? When I'm watching Ravi Coltrane performing here, it's funny. I'm sitting next to this guy and after after Ravi Coltrane did the first song, and again, they were just blowing the roof off, right? And so I turned to this guy next to me, who I had not met, I had no idea who he was, and I turned to him and I said, "You believe this fucking guy?" I just so overwhelmed. And the guy looks at me and he says, "I feel like a schoolgirl." and
Wow.
and you know, and but what he was capturing is my emotions are overwhelming me here. Okay, now I didn't waste the time to say, okay, well, why am I feeling this way, right? What's happening chemically in my body,
Yeah.
all this sort of stuff. Again, it's irrelevant. But we should also try to walk away with these experiences of, okay, now what? How do I see the world differently now? What does this mean to me? Yeah. Tolstoy asked the question, right? How then shall we live? Okay.
Mm.
So, so you have these experiences, but then you do want to bring reason back in. Okay. So again, it's that toggling back and forth. Okay. In the middle of the song, reason is not the place,
Right.
right? Just sit here, take it in, feel it. Okay. And then ask yourself, okay, how does this make me a better person? How does this make me wiser in some way? How then shall I live? Is the question.
Yeah. Reflecting on the awe after the fact,
Mhm.
right? Which is on brand for awareness to action, um, about the process of being aware, authentically experiencing something, and then taking something away from that.
I think I'm realizing here this needs to be a two-parter, because I think we've talked about the lived-in experience, why it's important to categorize ways of knowing, and instead of just pile them all into a pot of what was it, turnip stew,
Beef stew
beets.
with turnips.
Yes,
Beef.
yeah, that's a callback for the OGs.
That's right.
But I think to land this episode, the sort of the lived in experience of relationships in the kitchen, experience of ways of knowing, art is fun and aspirational and wonderful and meaningful and necessary. But arguments in the kitchen are going to happen more often. So Mario, say something about that.
Yeah, well, it's and this is why understanding what philosophers would call epistemic clarity, right, is important, and that basically just means understanding there are different epistemic tasks and using the right one for the right time. So, real regular person conversation here. So, so,
Just right at the kitchen table.
So what that means in the real world is that when we are engaging with other people, when we are discussing our life circumstances, when we are evaluating our a problem, for example, an opinion about something, a belief, whether it's, should I buy a house? Should I invade a country? Should I do, whatever it is, we have to understand that there are emotional aspects of most topics, and there are logic and factual topics of most things. And we run into trouble when we ignore the emotional aspects of it and just focus on the logic, or vice versa. Okay? And we conflate the two. My wife and I were, not too long ago at a social event. We were having there was a conversation going on that I was being very frustrated with, because the person that I was speaking to was just not being logical at all and making a strong case about something that, didn't make sense to me. And afterwards, I was expressing my frustration to my wife, and she said, "Well, the thing that that you have to remember is that she thinks with her feelings," referring to this other person. And I said, yeah, that's the problem, right? Because, our feelings shape and influence our thinking, but they shouldn't govern our thinking. And we shouldn't. And look, Hume said something about, reason being the slave of the passions. Okay. And that we tend to make decisions based on our emotions, and then we use rationality to justify them, etc. That's the natural state, but it's not the optimal state. And it's not how to have healthy, mature, wise conversations about things. We have to recognize, yeah, I feel really strongly about this. Okay. And my feelings lean me toward this, but, let me be open to the facts. And then again, toggle back and forth and understand. So if we're thinking with our feelings, I mean, just think about how, wrong that is. That's like saying, well, you know what? I feel with my thoughts. Okay. No, that's not feeling. That's thinking. Okay. So it would be just as wrong to say, well, I feel with my mind.
Important
No.
clarification.
Yeah.
Biologically speaking, we're not speaking biologically, we're speaking metaphorically. I guess maybe
Yes.
that's the word.
Yes.
Mythically, story based.
Exactly. Look, all these things, you can't separate these things out, right? So, it's not like you can, peel them apart. And again, that's the mistake that people make, thinking that you can, or
Right.
thinking that you should. And you shouldn't, but you should recognize when you are being impacted too much by one way or too much by the other.
And once again, we are slowing down dynamics enough to language them, to understand what we're doing, where we can practice it and build skills to be better at it.
Yeah.
Speaking of being better at it, Lee, do you have any sort of practical takeaways for the kids?
This week, I think we should notice when we are thinking with our feelings, because we all do it at some time or another. If you cannot find where you are thinking with your feelings, I know that won't be hard for me, then try to find where you're feeling with your thinking.
And note also, I mean, I think that's a great exercise and an important one. When people talk about these things, they have a tendency to look for where sentimentality is influencing their thoughts, but also recognize that sometimes anger and pride and some of these other emotional states can shift our thinking too, right? So don't just so keep the full range of emotions in play as you're thinking about this.
Listener, I'd like you to know that Mario just brought in the full range of emotions and how we should be using them to interrogate ourselves and explore this week.
Yeah. Well, do as I say, not as I
do. I'm just going to go add other ways of knowing to the bingo card.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, confirmations, or corrections, you can reach out to the links in the show notes. And remember, be kind with people and ruthless with ideas. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Take us to the bridge, Creek.
Throw us overboard. See if we can swim.
I got
back
that
up
reference,
to the shore.
though.
You did, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's James Brown.
Oh.
Take us to the bridge.
See now.
Oh,
No.
I was taking, it was like, I'm bringing sexy back.
We're on 3 different take it to the bridge.
That's interesting. Yeah, wow, okay.
I was at take it to the bridge. Throw it overboard. See if it can swim. No one's in the shore. All the lights are on and the blinds are down.
All right.
So good. We're not together.
Maceo. Take us to the bridge, Maceo. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.